Are you getting my voice?
Yes, sir.
What about screen? Are
Yes,
you
sir.
able to read? Okay, right. In yesterday class, we discussed about the deadlock and the deadlock handling or prevention techniques. So those are, we have two techniques here. First one, wait and die technique. Second one, wait and wound technique. Wait and wound technique. Right. So in this session, we are going to discuss about deadlock avoidance. So how to avoid the deadlock by using technique called wait for graph technique. So today we are going to discuss about wait for graph technique. Okay. See the theory first. So by using two approaches, we can avoid the deadlock here. So first see the theory. So we use this technique, this what is the technique? Wait for graph technique. We use this technique for deadlock avoidance. We use this technique for what? Deadlock avoidance. This is a simple method available to track if any deadlock situation may arise. So this is a simple method available to track if any deadlock situation may arise. We can track if any deadlock situation may arise. So this is a good method. Okay, and for each transaction, entering into the system, a node is created for each transaction. So for entering into the system, a node is created. See the this is the node here. A node is created. See the diagram. Wait for graph technique. So when here see this diagram, then you can understand this theory. When a transaction Ti, the transaction Ti a request for the lock on item say X, request for the lock on item say X, request for the lock on item say X, which is held by some other transaction Tj, which is held by some other transaction Tj. A directed edge is created from Tij to Tj. A directed edge is created from Tij to Tj. Okay, our understanding, when a transaction Ti is requesting for a data item which is held by some other transaction, that is Tj, the directed edge is created. Then the directed edge is created here from Tij to Tj. Okay, if Tj releases item X, if Tj releases item X, then the edge between them is dropped. The edge between this is going to be dropped, and Ti locks the data of the data item X. Are you understanding? See the diagram. When a transaction Ti requests for a lock on data item X, okay, this transaction is executed with Tj, Ti to Tj. Then the Tj releases item X. If the Tj is released item X, the edge between Ti to Tj is dropped. Okay, then Ti locks the data item X. Okay, so the system maintains this wait for graph for every transaction. The system maintains the wait for graph for every transaction. For every transaction, the system maintains the wait for graph. The system maintains wait for graph for waiting for some data item held by others. So the system keeps checking if there is any cycle in the graph. Okay, if there is any cycle in the graph, it will keep on checking in the wait for graph method. See, we have two approaches. We have two approaches here, first approach and second approach. See the first approach. We can use any of two approaches. The first approach explains the do not allow any request for an item. So what it is doing, first approach is doesn't allow any request for an item which is already locked by another transaction. If X is locked by Tj, then the Ti is not going to be allowed. This is not always feasible. It is not feasible. It is not always feasible and may cause the starvation. May cause the starvation. Starvation means what? I already explained, right? Deadlock and starvation. So here starvation occurs when one or more threads in your program are blocked from gaining access of resource. It is getting blocked. So if you are handling with multiple threads, one or more threads, okay, your program are blocked for gaining access of resource. It is cannot make progress. It's not going to be progress. This is not going to be process. So that is starvation problem, right? So that's what here. This is not always feasible and the starvation. It is not always feasible and the starvation, where a transaction indefinitely waits for a data item and can never acquire it. Can never acquire it. That is the starvation, right? Okay. What is the request for an item which is already locked by another transaction? If Ti having data item X, so Tj having data item X, so Ti is trying to request for that item. So that means what? Here we should not allow Ti. So do not allow any request for an item which is already locked by another transaction. So this is the first approach. So this is not always feasible. This is not always feasible, may cause the starvation problem, where that means what? Where the transaction indefinitely wait for a data item, indefinitely wait for a data item, it can never acquire it, cannot access it, it cannot, that means it cannot never access it. It can never access the data item here. That is the first approach. What we should do in the first approach? We should not allow any request for the item which is already locked by another transaction. That is important here. Okay. Right. Coming to the second approach. What is the second approach? Is to roll back. Second option is what? Transaction. Roll back the transaction. It is not always feasible to roll back the transaction. It is also sometimes it is always not feasible to roll back the made than the older one. When it is not feasible to roll back the younger transaction, as it may be important than the older transaction. So with the help of some related to already transaction chooser is aborted, which is to be aborted. This transaction is known as the victim, or the process is as victim selection. Okay, we have two approaches here. First approach is not allowing request for a data item which is already locked by another transaction. Okay, because of this is not feasible. Why? It may causes the starvation. Why? It may causes the starvation. That means when a transaction indefinitely wait for a data item and can never acquire it, we cannot access anytime, we cannot access it. Okay, so the second approach is what? Second option, to roll back one transaction, one of the transaction we are going to roll back. So second option is what? Roll back one of the transaction. So it is also not always feasible. So to roll back the younger transaction as it may important than the older transaction, older one. Okay, so with the help of some relative algorithm, that means a transaction is chosen which is to be aborted. So this transaction is known as victim, or this process is known as victim selection. Those are the two approaches we have in wait for graph method. Okay, so in this way we can avoid the deadlock. That's about deadlock concept. Okay, and file. So now we will see the transaction failures and how we can recover, how we can maintain the log files. Okay, what is log file and how we can maintain it. So today discuss here transaction failures. Transaction failure, comma, recovery, and loss. Log files. Now we are going to discuss about these things. Transaction failure, different transaction failures we have. So and how we are going to come and how we can maintain the log files, we will see. Okay, first try to understand the thing here. What is transaction failure? See, we are performing one transaction. We are doing one transaction. We are doing one transaction here. We are doing one transaction. That means what? We are performing multiple operations. We are doing one transaction means what? We are performing multiple operations. So have DBMS software, right? Database management system. So if you are performing multiple operations, those are all are submitted into the database. So this database management system responsible to execute all the operations, executing all the operations. So executing all the operations. So what is the responsible for DBMS? So the DBMS is responsible to execute all the operations of the transaction, all the operations of the transaction. You know, right? Atomicity property, acid property, atomicity. Atomicity. What is the rule for this atomicity? Small rule I said, right? One line. Do all operations or none of the operations. Do all operations or none of the operations. Do all the operations or none of the operations. That is called the atomicity, right? That means if you perform all the operations, so the transaction is going to be success. Okay, or either you are not performing any operation, the transaction is successful mode only. Now see, that means what? If you are following your atomicity rule, means you should not allow half of the operations to execute and half of bypass. Okay, you should not allow half of operations to execute. If you are so in the middle, the transaction failed. The middle, if one of the operation is not executing, so that we are getting the transaction fail. Okay, so that means we are able to perform some of the operations to be executed here. Half of the operations we are executing. That's called the transaction failure. That's called the transaction failure. Are you getting? So that means what? Transaction failure means what? Only half of the operations executed. Only half of the operations only executed. That means this caused the transaction fail. So what are the reasons? What are the reasons? So for the transaction failure, and how we can recover some operations to recover the data. Okay, recover the transaction. So what are those failures? See here. One. Failure. System failure or crash. One, transaction or system error. Transaction or system error. One, concurrency control enforcement. Fourth one, local errors or exception. One is disk failure. And the last sixth one is physical problem. Physical problem and The sixth one is physical problems or physical problems and catastrophes. Okay. These three are well recoverable and these two are difficult to recover. So what is the transaction failure? If you are able to perform half of the operations in the transaction, that may causes the transaction failure. Here we have explained some types of transaction failures. So like system failure or crash, the transaction or system error, and concurrency control enforcement, and the local errors or exceptions. These are all called, we can say these are well recoverable. So these failures are well recoverable. These failures are well recoverable and these are hard to recover. These two are. So first one, disk failure or physical problem or catastrophes. So we will see each and every failure. So the system failure and crash. For example, how these are happening because of some power failure, power failure, the power failure in the middle while you are doing transaction, or the network failure while you are doing transaction, and some some internal internal errors, internal errors. So these many causes for the system failure and crash. For this failure, what are the reasons? While you are doing, it may cause for power failure, and if in network failure, if any internal error happening, then the transaction going to be failed. That is called system failure or crash. Okay, system failure or second failure transaction is transaction or the system error. So while you are performing some operations, some one operation, while you are doing one operation, something is divided by zero, that may happen transaction value, and the system error. For example, you are transferring amount, right? That will be in integer format. So integer data type. So the while you are if the integer data type range is exceeded, so the system may throw the error. So system error will happen. Okay, so that's about the transaction or system error failure. So next one is concurrency control enforcement. Concurrency control enforcement means what? See, for example, we are performing one transaction, so that means we are performing number of operations here. Here not only one transaction, see, multiple transactions you are performing. T1 transaction, T3 transaction, you are performing multiple transactions concurrently. You are performing multiple transactions concurrently, then it may cause the deadlock problem, right? In that situation, what we are doing, so abort one transaction, we are aborting one transaction. We are aborting one transaction. So that is called concurrency control enforcement failure. To control number of concurrent operations, to control number of concurrent operations, to control number of concurrent operations. Okay, so like T1, T2, T3. So it may causes the deadlock and the transaction, one of the transaction is going to aborted. One of the transaction is going to be aborted. So this is called concurrency control enforcement failure. Failure transaction is what? Concurrency control enforcement. The next failure is local errors or exceptions. Local errors or exceptions. Local errors or exceptions. The local errors or exception due to during the transaction. During the transaction, okay, the local errors or exception occur. Here, the system releases one exception. System releases one exception. That is because the local error exception. When the exception will throw, you know, right Java. Already you know the exception handling. So what is the exception? It's the abnormal condition. Then we are getting normal condition. Then you are getting the interruption. So while you are here, you are doing one transaction. See, for example, in your account, we may have 1,000 rupees. Okay. In that 1,000 rupees, we are debited 800 rupees for one transaction. And so we are doing another transaction. So that means we have only 200 rupees here, but we are trying to transfer 500 rupees. Okay, so insufficient amount will be here. It may causes the exception, throw an exception, insufficient amount. Yes, all of you, are you getting? So this is also one type of transaction failure. Okay, next. So till now what we discussed here, this all are recoverable. These all are recoverable. I will say how those are recoverable. We will see in the log files. Okay. So coming to disk failure and physical problem catastrophes. First, disk failure means what? So this is the major problem. These two are major problems. So if we don't have backup, then it is difficult. If you have if you have the disk failure means, so if you don't have any backup, then recovering this disk failure is very difficult. So you have the messages, right? You are inserting disk not able to read the disk properly. You have seen you are trying to read some disk failure, some crash disk. If you are trying to read, so it may throw some exception like not able to read the disk properly. So these are the some situations in the disk failure. Okay, we can say this is the major problem. Okay, coming to physical problem or catastrophes. So physical problem catastrophe, while whole system get destroyed, then when whole system destroyed, then this is the failure of physical problem or catastrophe. That means when whole system will destroy, in which situation, when is physically happen. So while at the cracks or floods happen, and the whole system get destroyed. Then in that case, so this is hard to recover, right? So these are hard to recover failures. Okay. Are you understanding? Those are the transaction failures. And recovering, it is hard to recover this in these two situations, and these in this four failures, we can recoverable well recoverable this these values are well recoverable. So okay, so for recovering we have log files. So these log files are maintained by the system. These log files are maintained by our system. Okay. So the system maintains the log files. If you are using MySQL, the MySQL directory having the log files. Okay, you can observe on MySQL directory, we will have some log files. So using these log files, we can run recovery. Using these log files, we can run recovery. So the system can contain these log files. Whatever the database is, MySQL, Oracle, SQL Server, Sidewas, whatever. So the system maintains the log files. So because of the log files, they are able to recover even if your transaction may fail because of these failures. Okay, we can recover because of these log files. Okay, every software can contain these log files, so the system can maintain the log files. So the log files, what we have inside the log files, the details of transaction. What log files contains? The details of transaction. So if you are performing one transaction, means you are debiting, that means you are doing subtraction operation, and you are checking we are transferring to another account, that means you are adding amount to another account. Okay, and we are performing checking operations. It is happening while you are doing one transaction, means it performing multiple operations of inside of this. So for whatever happens, that the data we should maintain in the log file. That means this log file contains details of the transaction and the each transaction having transaction ID. Contains the transaction ID. So these log files write details of the transaction and assign the transaction ID to each transaction. So here the transaction ID, we are providing transaction ID for each transaction. That means, see here the log file contains in this way. So that start transaction, TM, in shortcut you can say TM. Okay, that contains transaction next. Write item, transaction, the ID of data item X. Old value, new value. log files, the information will be like this. So start transaction, then transaction ID, then write item. For writing item, for the transaction key ID, the data item is X here and old value, new value. Next. Read operation, read item, comma, transaction ID, item is X. Then if you are performing all this, then commit, details also available, the transaction ID. In the failure condition, it is going to be abort, right? Abort that transaction ID information. Remember this point, these are important. So log files. So in the log files, we write the details of the transaction and assign the transaction ID for each transaction. For each transaction, we are assigning transaction ID. And see here, we are performing write operation. We are performing transaction for doing write operation on X data item. So for old value and new value. Okay, then we perform a read operation on transaction on the data item X. Then we successfully committed for the transaction ID. And if any failure occurs, then it is going to aborted then with the transaction ID. So we are providing transaction ID. We are providing transaction ID and to know about the transaction. That means we know about the details of the each transaction. Okay, then we are able to recover it. This. All the data is available in the log files. Those generated by our MySQL software, which is available in the MySQL directory. We can see that is called log data information, logs information. Okay, any doubts? Yes, that's all about today's session. We'll see the brief things about the failures of the transaction and the recovery and log files in the tomorrow session.